Hi, I'm your host Vasco Duarte. Welcome to the Scrum Master Toolbox podcast, where we share tips and tricks from Scrum Masters around the world. Every day, we bring you inspiring answers to important questions that all Scrum Masters face day after day. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this very special Christmas episode. We have with us from Down Under, Australia, the part of Down Under that goes by the name Australia. We used to call it Oceania and so on. But there we go. It's Peter Lam. Hi, Peter.
G'day. How you doing? Merry Christmas.
Indeed. Merry Christmas, everybody. Merry Christmas. Peter, who I guess would rather be in a swimming pool right now.
Well, Christmas in Australia, it's hot. We wear shorts. We go to barbecues. We have cold seafood for Christmas lunch, and that's how we roll in with a beer in hand or a glass of wine in hand, and that's how we roll in Down Under for Christmas. It is hot, it is sweaty, and we're usually surrounded by bushfires. So that's how it works.
Yeah, hopefully not too many bushfires this year.
Hopefully not.
Peter has helped some of Australia's largest corporations and government departments realize the benefits from adopting digital, agile, and new ways of working as an Enterprise Agile Coach, a program manager, also as a people leader or head of projects. Peter is here today to talk about agile transformations in the context of business agility. So to get us started, Peter, share with us what have been the top 3 lessons that you took from your work with agile transformations?
Look, Vasco, that's a really tough one, but there's a couple of really sort of key things that I've learned over the years. The first one is that agile is necessary, but not sufficient for agility. Agile is not a goal in its own right. So our conversations, our debates, our arguments about, this method versus that method is actually immaterial, because the focus is not about agile. It actually should be about outcomes, right? And business outcomes. The second comment I sort of say is that, and this is a little bit controversial, is that sometimes big bang approaches are necessary to get the step change you need to start things moving, but it isn't really necessarily sufficient to sustain the momentum of the change you need. So sometimes you need a big bang to get things moving, but it's not enough to get things to where you want it to do. And I think the third aspect is that the speed of the transformation will be limited by the speed of learning.
So let's dive into one of those, or many of those, or all of those, as we go forward. First of all, I would like to take on your second one. Myself, I have said that Big Bang agile transformations are perfectly okay, and top-down agile transformations are perfectly okay. I totally agree that they are not sufficient, but sometimes they might even be necessary. We all talk about, all agile coaches and Scrum Masters talk about the need to have management support and so on. And there's very little more effective ways to show management support than to actually go through a company reorg, right? Like a big bang approach that reorganizes around agile teams, like, cross-functional teams that are responsible for end-to-end deliveries. I'm not sure that's how you see it exactly, but why don't you explain your perspective on the need sometimes for big bang approaches to agile transformation?
No, it sounds great. I mean, if you look at a large organization, right, we can go down many a rabbit hole. But typically a large organization has, this concept of span of controls and multiple layers of management. The challenge about layers of management, you have people and teams that create customer value. You then have the leaders at the top that set the strategic direction and drive market share and drive, shareholders and drive policy from a government standpoint. And you have all these layers in the middle. And a lot of the managers in their layers in the middle do what managers do, which is about reducing variability. They're trying to support their people. They're trying to connect the different parts of the organization, which is typically constructed in a really specialist line. So you have your software developers over here, you have your security folk over here, you have your infrastructure folk over here, and those business people, they're in another building. And typically that's how they run for efficiency. So they run for what you would term from a manufacturing standpoint, resource efficiency. If you try to connect all these random teams together and these random individuals to make this cross-functional team, many people, you have to step on the toes of many managers to make this happen. Many organizational boundaries, and that's hard. Like, let's be simple. Their design and the way that they've run their teams and their collection teams around efficiency Whereas we're saying, well, we don't want resource efficiency or people efficiency and utilization. We want to be more efficient and optimized for customer goals. So we want to be more effective. So it's a different paradigm, which is different to how the organization is structured and set up. So if you go through a big bang and a shift and things like that, it does create those ways of change and the organizational shifts that actually allowed skilled coaching practitioners and skilled enterprise coaches to help shift how these pieces land, which then allow you to connect different pieces together to help start to stitch teams and groups of teams together.
Absolutely. The contrast between efficiency and productivity, or in the agile circles, very often people call it effectiveness, right? Like delivering things that have impact, is huge. And sometimes we kind of lose focus of that. And you were talking about the traditional organization, usually siloed around skill areas, right? Like as you said management is in another building. Well, for many of our customers, I'm guessing for you and for me, management is in another country.
That's exactly right.
So like you have the cultural problems, the distance problems, the miscommunication, and sometimes a broken telephone syndrome, and so on and so forth. And I do remember when working with large organizations that one of the common anti-patterns that would arise, if you will, is this idea that middle management was kind of the let's call it the beep burger meat, right? Like there's a good bun on top, there's a good bun at the bottom, and then there's the beep in the middle. And that is something that even leadership kind of conveyed clearly, right? And a lot of the transformations need to go through that fact that middle management is there, as you put it, to reduce variability. But variability is the normal realm of product and service development, right? Like that's why we are looking for cross-functional teams and end-to-end responsibility, so that variability can be contained and handled by the people who have to deal with it, rather than through layers and, of course, slow layers of management. In this big bang approaches, of course, then the big challenge is, how do we go about it? How do we go about setting that up so that we don't, at the same time, alienate middle management, which has, if you will, the hand on the brake all the time?
I think it's a very simple characterization to say that middle managers don't want change, which is potentially true in some areas, right? But in many cases, they are also the people that stitch the organization back together after our organizational design experts have put us into these specialist silos. They're the ones that are negotiating to try and drive and balance the often competing demands from the different executives. So they have a valuable glue role perspective to play, as well as in a lot of cases, lots of skills and experience to coach team members to step up to become, the best things they can be, and help them develop. So they play a very, very important role. But the larger your organization is, unfortunately, the more of the weight of the management reporting, the structures, the PowerPoints start to weigh increasingly on their time, and they lose that focus on building and developing people. I think that in some places that you work, they go through a very, very large shake-up, if you like, and realign so that they dramatically increase the number of people that are working in teams and tools, and then they actually go and get stuff done. Certainly in some cases, some middle managers love it, right? Because they've gone, the super technical lead developer who then gets promoted to become a manager or a dev manager might love his people and love coaching and training, but at the end of he or she may prefer to actually be on the tools. So there's certainly pros and cons around how this works, right? And in a lot of cases, organizations are adopting that Spotify-esque model to try and shake things loose and to try and shake loose the level of innovation and speed back to market responsiveness and engagement they want to do. So what we are certainly seeing in Australia, and I think believe certainly in other parts of the world, is the wholesale adoption of this chapter tribe logic that was first made famous, many, many years ago in a little video on, I don't know what it's on now. I think it's on the Spotify engineering blog where originally it was posted, and it's circulated across the world from there as the template on how to do organizational design. Of course, very few people, particularly the managers and consultants that advise, that have watched the second video or understood the culture that underpins such a model.
Yeah, so the Spotify model, for those of you that are not aware of it, I'll put the link on the show notes so that you can go and read the original article. But just to be clear, it is nothing new. It is a much cooler twist on the very old project and matrix organization. It has with it some novelty, and that comes from agility and the focus on this end-to-end squads, as they call them, and the ability for aligned autonomy. I think that's how Henrik Nieberry defined it, right? Like to create alignment, but at the same time to provide autonomy so that squads can move fast and deliver quickly, but always be aligned. There's some other work on that aspect. So if you look for alignment and agility, there's some other work on creating that alignment and autonomy that is very important. But of course, those are all concepts. They are abstract concepts. Even Spotify doesn't use the Spotify model, so the joke goes, right? Like it's an idealized version of what they were trying to put together, and they evolved it. So they learned and evolved it and no longer use it as it was once defined. Perhaps they have published some newer videos or blogs on that I'm not aware of, but definitely has changed and evolved. And the other lesson that you mentioned was the speed of the transformation is limited by the speed of learning. And I really want to dive into that because I think it's an incredibly important insight, especially in the context that we need to build those learning cycles, right? Like it's not enough to say, I want to learn. You actually have to organize around that learning and take on the consequences, which is yet change on top of change. So walk us through that principle and what do you mean by it, Peter?
Look, I think there's a lot of, I always say that all learning is good, but not all learning is important right now. And whilst it's great to look at what, Amazon or some of the other tech companies are doing, that's not necessarily what's relevant for where we are today. The example I draw is actually from the world of fitness. And the example, if you look what an Olympic swimmer does, like a Michael Phelps in years gone by when he was training, is an enormously tall person with giant feet, swam for the US and won 1 million gold medals, right? Incredible athlete, right? And has 12 rashers of bacon for breakfast and 12 eggs and swims 7 hours a day. And whilst we can take cues from what he may choose to do to prepare for the Olympics, the reality is the vast majority of us would settle down for just doing a couple of laps of the pool every 2 days and be light years better off than where we are today. And I think this sort of comes back to this concept that the speed of transformation is limited by the speed of learning. It's great to take diet tips and agility tips from where organizations are, like Spotify, for example, and there the model is, but you got to understand where their journey started and you got to understand what they've learned and the experiments they ran to reach the point where that model made sense for them. For instance, Spotify spent an enormous amount of time decoupling their technology and decoupling the various components of their app before they went to this model to allow the teams to operate autonomously. For instance, ING, which is another case study everyone talks about, again, invest in their technology to decouple it to allow the teams to do this. And if you start unpicking this, it comes back to the speed of your transformation limited by learnings. If you've gone and chosen to use a very large platform technology as your core tech play as modification, then you're not going to be able to go down the agile path quite as quickly as if you built the software yourself.
Absolutely. Another aspect of that is what other things did they invest in? Like most famously, Spotify invested a huge amount in agile coaching. They had loads of agile coaches to support their squads. Most organizations that I've gone through, and perhaps you also, Peter, try to skimp on that, right? Like they want to have an agile coach for each 10 teams or something like that. While Spotify, I don't know exactly what their numbers were, but definitely closer to 1-to-1 rather than 10-to-1 agile coaches. So that's also another aspect. And as you describe that, I'm reminded that specifically in the aspect of learning from others, it pays off to look at it from different multiple perspectives. In the case of Spotify, they famously got a load of money to start investing and growing the company while they were making almost zero money. Right? Most organizations we work with today are not in that situation. They can't afford doing that kind of investment. In other cases, like ING and other banks, we have to look at why did they want to transform? And there, for example, the strategy aspect may be critical. ING is a bank, but a lot of the banks out there are not trying to do the same as ING. They are not expanding internationally. They're not creating a new portfolio of digital services and so on and so forth. Therefore, they have no impetus or reason to transform either. So,
or more interestingly, ING doesn't see itself competing in the financial services space. It's quite openly said that its key competitors are Google of the world, right? And therefore they need to compete against Google because that's where the digital transaction will be for the future. So they've transformed, and this ties to the first principle, agile is necessary but not sufficient. The outcome they wanted wasn't agility. The outcome they want was the speed that they could then compete against the digital beasts that rule the internet at this point in time, and they wanted to take their share of market in that space, right? But if I take a step back to the second principle about the speed of transformation is related to your speed of learning, a lot of cases we're still teaching things like Scrum, which is fine. Scrum was published in the 1980s?
End of 1990s, yeah.
Yeah. So the new product development game, right? And we're still teaching it sort of today. So everyone talks about, being, when I talk about your single press deployment, build the environment, deploy the code into production, we commonly talk about continuous integration, continuous delivery. I first learned about that on Kix domains on COBOL systems, in mainframe systems.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. So mainframes have auto build and auto deploy as that's how they do stuff. They didn't call it CI/CD. They said this is the most logical way to build. You build an environment, you deploy your code into it, you run your shakedown tests. It's all automated. Press one button, don't make any mistakes. Why? Because COBOL, if you make a procedural mistake in a mainframe, it causes lots of problems, right? Lots of transaction problems. So that's why they did it, to reduce the risk. So now we're talking about, we've got to roll out this latest and greatest CI/CD thing. You go, well, hang on, but this is no different to what happened in the 80s. People talk about, Amazon is great in the AWS, Amazon Web Services is fantastic and modern. And absolutely, it is brilliant about what it does. But to be clear, in the 1970s and 80s, people were renting cycle time for punch card processing, right, at universities, which is no different to what you're doing now with Amazon. All they've done is make it applicable using credit card. So a lot of these things have existed since 70s and 80s and 90s. The fact the organization doesn't do it isn't because it didn't exist. It's because your team or your organization may have chosen not to, or you're not aware of. And if you sort of think about where some of these organizations have built and evolved and learned from, there's two options you have. You either go, well, I'm going to help your organization learn and innovate over the last, if you're learning Scrum, so from the mid-90s onwards, so I've got 20 years of learning and evolution to take delivery experience to build on you. Or the other option is just do as I say, and we'll try and shortcut that learning process. But either way, it's not a case of just implementing a new method. You actually have to learn how to use it and why they learn those techniques.
Which, of course, takes us to the first lesson you talked about, which is agile is necessary but not sufficient. So let's explore that for a minute. I mean, we talked about big bang approaches and how sometimes the way we talk about change and do change has an impact. We talked about the importance of learning. Like, all of those two are not about agility, although they affect agile. But let's talk about that first one. Agile is necessary but not sufficient for agility. What do you mean by that, Peter?
Well, I think the focus at the moment from lots of organizations and people is, we want to adopt agile, we want to be agile, we want to be agile. That's fine, but agile's not the outcome. But when you start to say, well, what is the outcome you're trying to drive? And you start to unpick it. Then you start to talk about some of the business outcomes that they're trying to achieve and some of the things they're achieving. So whilst lots of agile folk will talk about, let's use SAFe, let's use Kanban, let's use Scrum, let's use any of these methods, and there's a massive religious argument about it within organizations, in many cases, the organization doesn't care. And this is something where, whilst it's great that our coaches want to do the right thing by their people, in many cases, they're trying to, most of these arguments are driven by what can they teach, what can they certify, and what can they make their money on. It's not about the customer. It's not about the customer and the outcomes that they're trying to drive in listed companies, for instance, what the shareholders are looking for. So when we start to talk about what we're doing about agile and all that kind of stuff, we say, we've got to, got to innovate, be close to customers, what Amazon does. Sure, I guess that's important. But if I look at most listed companies in Australia, they're interested not in what's happening in 3 years' time. They're actually interested in the next quarterly earnings report they have to go to the stock market for. Right? What is going to affect my share price? What is going to affect my earnings per share? What is going to drive the next sale? All those kinds of conversations. And what is the predictability that I've given in guidance for profitability to the share market over the next 12, 18 months? And that's driven commonly to lots of organizations, right? If you take government organizations, they're driven by different things, but typically it's no different. Legislation's been written, policy has been published, And there's a real clear mandate that on this day we turn it on. How we get there is less important, but we must get there.
And that clarity of direction, which sometimes isn't there either, but that clarity of direction, of course, is also, in my mind, an enabler for Agile adoption, right? Like Agile is kind of an enabler for the organization to try to reach its objectives. Now, we can have a long discussion about what the objectives might be. That's another topic. But we need to focus Agile as an enabler for the success of the teams and the organization. How do you do that, Peter? How do you help your customers and the teams you work with to kind of look at Agile that way, as an enabler for success rather than the goal or the end point?
That's a really tough conversation, right? I think the opening position is people turn around and say, well, we want an Agile X, you're the dudes to come and help us do it, come help us sort it out. And that's typically where the conversation is. And if I look at some of the conversations I've had to go, yeah, okay, cool. Yes, you want Agile. But you want to, inverted commas, be seen to be going Agile and get some traction, but not really change anything for their first 6 months, right? There's a lot of that keeps coming around. And I keep asking the question, things like, so what is it that you're trying to achieve? And they keep repeating themselves again and again, because this is the record that they've got and the pattern that they've got in their head. And eventually, one of these conversations, I was working with a client, they said, well, look, I've told you, I just wish we wouldn't flip and spend 2 years building a product that no one wanted. I said, okay, can I make that 6 months? And you could see the moment of clarity, they go, how are you going to do that? Let's look at your biggest program. Let's start there. And they said, are you willing to, take risks? I said, sure, we'll back the risk. We're happy to split the wins if you want, right? We can put, we certainly could put fees at risk if that's what you want to play ball. And I've had the exec go, you've got big kahunas, buddy. I said, yeah, but I can show you how to not take 2 years to build a product and launch it that no one wants. Because, hey, what happens if I talk to a customer in the first 6 months and say, do you want this? And they go, no. I go, here's your feedback, boys.
Yeah, and that's a huge gain. I mean, if you compare that with 2 years, just doing the same in 6 months, it's 18 months of win.
Yeah, correct, right? But then you've got to keep pushing the button to ask the question, what does success look like? What is actually the game you're trying to do? Like when I talk to another customer who's in the financial services space, they keep going, oh, well, we need an Agile this, we need product owners, we need this, we need that. And you sort of break it down. That's not the issue. So what the issue is that their team has grown dramatically, but their team and the leaders aren't familiar with working at teams at this scale. So they actually don't know how to delegate.
We're getting close to the end, Peter, but I definitely don't want to go away before we get to discuss the question about the Agile coaching capability. So as the size of the organizations grow, of course, so do the challenges of supporting the transformation. Whether you start with a big bang or a slow change, it doesn't matter. The bigger the organization, the bigger the challenges. Now, Agile coaching and the competencies related to that are critical for the long-term adoption, right? So having that success definition in mind, you still need to help the organization move towards that, because the alternative would be a top-down, not supported transformation, which would lead to, of course, a different adoption for every silo, right? There would be no way to align the whole organization if we don't provide aligned support. And at least in my mind, definitely Agile and agility and Agile approaches help to create some form of alignment. What have you learned about creating and, of course, building that Agile coaching capability in larger organizations?
It's tough. You've got, I think in many cases, you've got two different main approaches. Approach one says you buy coaches and bring them in, right? Which is the most common tactic places playing. Sometimes you might use large consultancies and others to drive it. But the challenge you have is that if you're working with large consultancies, in many cases, there's a compromise perhaps that you might make between brand and quality, right? That's just the nature of how the organization works. If you buy some of the best coaches, and certainly I don't know how it works through Europe, to be honest, but certainly through Australia, a lot of the top coaches are relatively independent, which is great. The problem is, of course, how do you forge coaches who are generally fairly independent contracting type people? How do you forge them into a singular team to drive a shared team outcome? That is incredibly hard. And I've certainly seen it come apart in lots of organizations. But I've actually had coaches go, well, I'm not teaching that because that ain't Agile. And I'm like, well, if it ain't Agile, don't do it. But if you don't want to do it, that's fine. Just don't do it in this building. Like, they're just so many coaches are, because you and I have been around the block for a long time, right? So we've seen them come and go. People who are in the first couple of years of the agile journey, inverted commas, as experts, sort of go, yeah, no, this is the one way of doing it, and if you don't do it, this ain't agile. And they don't understand that actually, when you've been around the block, it's like, you want to do A, you want to do B, you want to C. Let me help the people, let me help the teams, let me drive the outcomes you are looking for and the organization's looking for. We're a bit more pragmatic, right? They've lost a lot of that, right? The third option you have is building your own, right? And the challenge you have with building your own is if you build your talent, if you find the right people that can demonstrate the right sets of behaviors and give them the right sets of skills, they can do amazing things. Why? Because you can't transplant a culture from somewhere else. They know people, they know the organization, they see the light, they become those believers and those advocates for you to help drive things across, which is fantastic. Problem is, the journey of transformation in a large organization might take you 2 or 3 years to go through the first phase. And then guess what? You got the next 2 or 3 years of the next phase. And whilst a lot of coaches love the journey and love starting, they go, oh, well, it becomes really, really repetitive doing the same thing. Yeah, but that's kind of your job. Flipping organizations, flipping teams, having the same conversations around going from command and control through to, trying to empower and be goal directed. So then you need to be really delicate about how do you build their skills enough for them to start that way of a transformation, but then how do you think about reskilling them to a different set of skills to do the next wave? And I think that's where the trick comes into it for that. So all three have pros and all three have cons. Do I think that there is a new magical way of doing it? I've worked with all three and I can say that they're all tough.
Absolutely. And at the end of the day, reality is always a mix of many different things, right? So it's good to have those in mind and to try to adopt some of those at the right time in the transformation. So, for example, I can imagine that buying and bringing in some coaches, whether independent or from a larger consultancy at the start might be useful, but slowly move that towards the inside, towards the organization itself, because there's also the aspect of this long term. And I've been involved with all kinds of transformations, including these three that you mentioned. But as you develop internally coaches, don't forget that outside there's a big market and it's easy for them to go and get a good job or even start their own firm later on. So you also need to look at renewal. At the end of the day, it ends up being a skill concern for the organization. Like, how do we grow and maintain the people with the right skills? I mean, in some organizations, especially in larger organizations, at some point you can hire out the market where there's no one else to hire anymore.
And certainly, you're 100% right. And certainly in the organizations that I've been working with, that's certainly the scenario that we're going through. And when you have a number of large organizations going down the journey, the market is under enormous pressure. So you train them up and then they choose to move on or to leave, which is unfortunate. But I've always thought about agile coaching as simply, for most people, as a transient career. Because if someone comes in, they learn these skills about how to work with great teams and how to identify waste and remove them practically. What's exciting for me is when they go, hey, there's a senior team leader role or exec role or whatever, director role. Go for your life. Go take that way. Take those skills. Take the humanity. Take the better ways of working. Take the learning mindset. Right. Take that and then lead that group and that division that you're working with to adopt those new ways of working, right? And it should be a bit of a funnel. So people come in to learn cool stuff and we want them to go back into the business, right? To do great stuff, right? And it becomes a bit of this cyclical process. You don't want to stay in the agile coaching space forever, right?
In fact, I would say even, and that's something that I've worked with some larger transformations on setting up, which is, I would say that even the leadership positions of the future should go to the people who have that hands-on experience of increasing throughput, removing waste, organizing different teams around aligned but autonomous ways of working, right? Like that kind of skill set is going to be a huge value add for the organization at the middle management and later on even at the top management layer.
Absolutely, because if you look at how executive promotions go, you need to have big ticket items drive big change, right? But what we do know is working across different parts of the business and getting that breadth of experience is only going to strengthen that person's ability to drive that leadership outcome. And increasingly driving outcomes in corporate Australia or corporate global is about a globalized team. It's going to be cross-functional. It's going to be complex. It's going to be messy. It's going to be ambiguity. Hey, guess what skills work for this? We know testing and learning. We know measuring stuff works, right? We know that having smart people and then removing, the robots for them doing the cool stuff they want to do to solve problems. We know that works. All this stuff comes back to Agile, and from a team standpoint and from an organizational standpoint, it's about agility, right? How do we sense and respond to the change in the environment around us? How do we drive the change around us, right? So the more of our leaders that come from this background, right, the better off the organizations are going to be. And what we do know in some of the clients we work with, those who work in the Agile constructs are distinctly happier than those that don't.
Absolutely.
Right? Like there's a marked shift. Once they go, within 3 to 6 months, you can measure they are genuinely happier in the new environment than they were in the old one, right? Happy people.
Happy people, and Merry Christmas, everybody. We're getting close to the end, Peter. Before we go, though, I do want to ask you, what's the one resource you could point our listeners to? Something, a book, a podcast, a website, whatever that is, for them to understand and be an active and productive part of their organization's agile transformation.
So one of my favorite books, and I'm holding it up, you probably can't see it as a group, is called Lean Enterprise, How High-Performance Organizations Innovate at Scale by Humble, Molesky, and O'Reilly. I'm really lucky, and I think one of the authors joked, I've had it signed by all 3 authors, right? I will say, if you read it, you understand all the theory you need to be an Enterprise Agile Coach. But good luck, because there's a lot of content in there. I think they're all amazing people. I've heard them all speak. I can't speak about the authors highly enough, but I will say it is quite a dense book and it requires enormous effort to get through.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll put the link on the show notes, make sure that people can easily find out the book. And they all have talks on YouTube as well, so you can go ahead and listen to them yourself. Peter, it's been a pleasure. So once again, thank you very much for being with us. Where can people find out more about you and the work that you're doing?
Look, it's been indeed a pleasure. The best way to find me is on LinkedIn, because that's where a lot of us are. And it's just Peter Lam in Australia. I will confess, I'm one of the few people that does not have a photo on LinkedIn. So it was a form of just being lazy, not putting a photo up. But as it turns out, I'm probably the few that doesn't have one. So Peter Lam in Australia, mention this podcast, and I'd love to connect.
Yeah, absolutely. Do connect and ask questions from Peter. I'll put the link on the show notes so that people can easily go and find you on LinkedIn. Peter, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for your generosity with your time and your knowledge.
Thank you very much, Rashko.
We really hope you liked our show. And if you did, why not rate this podcast on Stitcher or iTunes? Share this podcast and let other Scrum Masters know about this valuable resource for their work. Remember that sharing is caring.